Hello, story lovers, and welcome. I'm so glad you could join me today. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know which city or country you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The ghost of Julian Vance haunted the city he had once built. Not the man himself, but the specter of his former glory. It lingered in the sharp crystalline peaks of the skyline, in the Vance Tower that still bore his name even after it had been ripped from his hands. It echoed in the hushed conversations on the trading floor, a cautionary tale whispered by men in suits finer than the one Julian now wore. His was a Tom Ford, a relic from his old life, the fabric now thinning at the elbows, the bespoke cut hanging loosely on a frame, diminished by more than just weight loss. It was a costume of a king now living in exile in a kingdom of his own making. His exile was a fifth-floor walk-up in a borough that the new gleaming city had tried its best to forget. The air in his small room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the heavier aroma of failure. A single window looked out onto a brick wall, a view that felt like a judgment. On his nightstand, next to a stack of overdue bills, sat a single framed photograph. It wasn't of a wife or a child, he had neither, but of him and Alistair Finch, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning on the day they took their company. Nexus. Public. The glass over Alistair's face was cracked. Julian had thrown it against the wall the day the world learned of his bankruptcy. The day Alistair's betrayal became front-page news. He had picked it up, not to save the memory, but to keep the evidence of his own naivety close. It was a reminder, a penance. Most days Julian walked. He would leave his cramped apartment and trace the paths of his former life like a pilgrim visiting a desecrated shrine. He would stand across the street from the Vance Tower, its polished marble and smoked glass facade reflecting a sky that seemed bluer, more opulent from that vantage point. He remembered selecting that specific cut of Italian stone, remembered the arguments over the lobby's expansive, minimalist design. He had built it to be a monument to logic, to the cold, clean power of data. It was sterile, perfect, and utterly devoid of warmth, much like the life he had led within it. Now he couldn't even get past the security desk. His walks were a ritual of self-flagellation. He would pass the restaurants where he'd brokered billion-dollar deals over meals he couldn't remember tasting, the galleries where he'd purchased art as investments rather than for beauty. Each landmark was a station of his own cross. The city, once his chessboard, was now a labyrinth of his own regrets. He was 42 years old. A man who had climbed to the summit of the world only to be shoved from the peak, left with nothing but the long fall down. The laughter of his former colleagues, a chorus of schadenfreude he'd read about in the business pages, was a constant ringing in his ears. The bankrupt genius, the tech titan who couldn't see the viper in his own boardroom. One Tuesday in October, the sky wept a cold, persistent drizzle. The city was a watercolor of blurred headlights and glistening asphalt. Julian, without an umbrella, walked with his head down, the collar of his worn coat turned up against the wind. He was heading nowhere in particular, just moving to keep the ghosts at bay. He turned a corner and sought refuge under the awning of a shuttered bookstore. And that's when he saw her. She was a small thing, a girl of maybe 8 or 9, huddled against the grimy brick. Her coat was thin, her sneakers soaked through, but she wasn't shivering, or at least she didn't seem to notice the cold. She was utterly still, her entire world contained in the pages of a thick paperback she held in her small hands. Her dark hair was matted with rain, pasted to her forehead, but her eyes, wide and fiercely intelligent, were locked on the text. Julian, a man who hadn't felt a genuine emotion outside his own bubble of misery in months, felt an unexpected jolt. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was curiosity. He glanced at the cover of the book. It was upside down from his angle, but he could make out the title, A Brief History of Time. Stephen Hawking. He blinked, the rain dripping from his hair onto his forehead. He had tried to read that book in college, a student at the top of his class in computer science, and found it a dense, challenging struggle. And this child, this slip of a girl, huddled in a damp doorway, was reading it with the placid concentration of someone reading a fairy tale. For the first time in over a year, Julian Vance forgot about his own ruin. A question, sharp and clear, cut through the fog of his self-pity. Who is this child? He stood there for a long time, watching her turn a page with a delicate, almost reverent touch, oblivious to him, to the rain, to the entire uncaring city. The ghost of Julian Vance, the bankrupt millionaire, felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since he first wrote a line of code that worked. He felt wonder. The image of the girl was seared into his mind. That night, in his small, quiet room, the silence wasn't filled with the usual specters of Alistair's treachery or the mocking headlines. It was filled with the memory of a small, determined face, illuminated by the fading light of a dreary afternoon, lost in the cosmic ballet of space-time. He couldn't sleep. The profound absurdity of it gnawed at him. A homeless child reading advanced theoretical physics. It was a glitch in the matrix of his grim reality, a data point that didn't fit the algorithm of his despair. The next day, the drizzle had given way to a weak, watery sunlight. Julian returned to the same spot, a nervous energy thrumming in his chest. He didn't know what he would say or do, only that he had to see her again. He clutched a paper bag containing a warm croissant and a carton of milk, a purchase that had felt both foolishly extravagant and absolutely necessary. She was there. Not in the doorway, but on a nearby park bench, the same book open on her lap. She was sketching something in a small, tattered notebook with a pencil no bigger than her finger. He approached slowly, so as not to startle her. "Hello," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She looked up, her eyes cautious, ancient. They were dark brown, so dark they were almost black, and they held a startling depth. She didn't speak, just watched him, her hand protectively covering her notebook. "I saw you yesterday," Julian continued, feeling clumsy and out of place. "Reading. That's a very advanced book." A flicker of something, pride perhaps, softened her guarded expression. "It's interesting," she said, her voice quiet but clear, without the lilt of a typical child. The part about imaginary time is hard to visualize, though. Julian was taken aback. She wasn't just reading the words. She was processing the concepts. He held out the paper bag. "I thought you might be hungry." She eyed the bag, then looked back at his face, her gaze analytical. It was the look of someone who had learned the hard way that every gift has a price. "Why?" she asked. The simple question disarmed him. Why? Because seeing her had been the first thing to make him feel human in a year? Because her impossible existence gave him a strange, irrational sliver of hope? "Because no one should have to read Hawking on an empty stomach," he said, managing a faint smile. It felt like stretching a muscle he hadn't used in years. She seemed to consider this, then gave a small, solemn nod. She took the bag and ate with a slow, deliberate neatness that suggested she was savoring every bite. He sat on the other end of the bench, a respectful distance between them. "My name is Julian," he offered. "Maya," she replied between bites. He learned through a conversation that he guided with gentle, careful questions that she was 9 years old. She spoke of her parents in the past tense, vague details that hinted at a tragedy she had no words for. She had been on her own for a while, a ghost in the city's forgotten corners, sleeping in shelters when she could, and spending her days in the public library, her only true home. She was slipping through the cracks of a system he, in his old life, had never even had to think about. As they spoke, he felt a part of his old self reawakening, the problem solver, the builder. Here was a problem of staggering proportions, a child of astounding intellect, abandoned and adrift. His own problems, his lost fortune, his wounded pride, suddenly seemed shamefully self-indulgent. They were the problems of a man who had once had everything. Maya's problems were the problems of a child who had nothing. An idea, reckless and insane, began to form in his mind. It was a terrible idea. He was broke. He was unstable. His apartment was a shoebox. He had nothing to offer anyone. And yet, he had a roof. He had 4 walls. He had a little money from selling the last of his watches. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely more than she had. "Maya," he said, the word feeling heavy in his mouth, "how would you feel about not sleeping in a shelter tonight? My place isn't much, but it's warm and safe." She stopped eating and looked at him, her gaze so intense it felt like it was scanning his very soul. He braced himself for her to run, for her to scream. He was a stranger, a haggard-looking man in a worn-out suit offering a preposterous proposition. But she didn't run. She simply looked at him for a long, silent moment, and in her deep, knowing eyes he saw not fear, but a flicker of the same thing he'd felt the day before, wonder. "Okay," she said quietly. And with that single word, Julian Vance, the bankrupt millionaire, took the first step out of his own ruin and into a future he could never have imagined. The first few days were an exercise in profound awkwardness. Julian's tiny apartment, once a solitary cell of his own making, was now a shared space. Maya's presence was a quiet but powerful force. She took up almost no physical room, curling up on the lumpy sofa he'd made into a makeshift bed for her, but her existence filled every corner. The air, once stagnant with regret, now seemed to vibrate with a new, uncertain energy. He didn't know how to be a guardian. He didn't know what 9-year-old girls ate or what they did. His first attempt at a proper meal was burnt toast and scrambled eggs that were more rubber than food. Maya ate it without complaint, a small, polite smile on her face. He learned she had a severe allergy to peanuts after buying a jar of peanut butter, a fact she delivered with the calm detachment of a scientist stating a chemical property. He threw it out immediately, his heart hammering with the fear of his own incompetence. He set up a small card table for her by the window, giving her the best light. It became her domain. She would spend hours there. Surrounded by books, she'd convinced the librarian to let her check out with Julian's address as a guarantee. She read everything: biology textbooks, poetry collections, histories of ancient civilizations. Her hunger for knowledge was insatiable. Julian, meanwhile, began the arduous process of trying to do the right thing. He made calls to social services, his voice carrying an echo of the authority it once held. He was met with a wall of bureaucracy and thinly veiled suspicion. Who was he? A man with no job, no stable address, who had taken in a child he'd found on the street. It sounded, even to his own ears, like a prelude to a tragedy. But he persisted, fueled by a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. He learned that Maya was an official ghost. Her parents, freelance programmers, had died in a car accident over a year ago. They had no family to speak of, and in a tragic oversight, Maya's case had been lost in a sea of paperwork. She had simply walked away from the chaos and disappeared into the city. He felt a cold dread at the thought of her being swallowed by the system, becoming a ward of the state, her brilliant mind filed away and forgotten. The thought was unbearable, so he lied. He told the overworked social worker on the phone that he was a distant relative, a cousin of her father's, and that he was prepared to take full responsibility. It was a lie born of desperation, a shield against a world he knew would not understand her. One evening he was hunched over his old laptop, staring at a screen of code. It was a project from his past, an algorithm for predictive market analysis that had been the cornerstone of Nexus. It was brilliant, revolutionary, but had a persistent flaw, a tiny anomaly that he and his team of world-class engineers had never been able to iron out. He was looking at it for no reason other than to remember a time when his mind had been sharp, when he had been a creator. Maya came to stand beside him, peering at the screen. "What's that?" she asked. "Just an old project," he mumbled, ready to close the laptop. "The recursive loop is inefficient," she said, her voice soft. "It's creating a data bottleneck, see?" She pointed a small finger at a complex string of symbols. "If you redefine the base case and use a memoization table to cache the results, you'll eliminate the redundant computations. The temporal complexity would drop from exponential to polynomial." Julian froze. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He stared at the lines of code, then back at her. What she had just said was not the observation of a curious child. It was the elegant, precise diagnosis of a master programmer. It was the solution that had cost his company millions in wasted processing cycles, the solution that a room full of PhDs couldn't find. And this 9-year-old girl had seen it in less than 30 seconds. He slowly, deliberately, made the changes she suggested. He redefined the base case. He wrote a few quick lines to create a cache. He reran the simulation. The progress bar, which usually crawled, flew across the screen. The results appeared almost instantly. The anomaly was gone. The data was clean. Perfect. He leaned back in his chair, a profound silence enveloping him. The hum of the old laptop was the only sound in the room. He looked at Maya, who was watching him with a curious expression, as if she didn't understand why he was so stunned. To her, the solution had been obvious, as simple as seeing that 2 + 2 = 4. In that moment, Julian's world didn't just fracture. It was pulverized and reassembled into a new, terrifying, and exhilarating shape. He wasn't just sheltering a homeless girl. He wasn't just protecting a bright child. He was in the presence of something extraordinary, a generational intellect. The mockery of his peers, the sting of his bankruptcy, it all dissolved into utter insignificance. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the small girl standing beside him, a girl who could see the hidden architecture of the universe in a string of code. A new purpose, fierce and absolute, crystallized in his heart. He had to protect this mind, no matter the cost. The revelation of Maya's genius changed everything. The tiny apartment was no longer a symbol of Julian's failure, but an incubator for her incredible mind. He bought a large whiteboard with a chunk of his dwindling funds, and it immediately became the room's centerpiece, quickly filling with complex equations and branching diagrams that were as much art as they were mathematics. Their life fell into a new rhythm. He was no longer just her guardian. He was her student, her collaborator, her first and most devoted believer. He started testing her, not out of doubt, but out of sheer awe. He gave her logical puzzles from his university days, cryptographic challenges, theoretical physics problems he barely understood himself. She solved them with an unnerving combination of intuitive leaps and rigorous logic. She didn't just find the answers. She found more beautiful, more elegant paths to them. She saw patterns in the chaos, connections that were invisible to him. This new reality spurred him to action. The vague lie to social services would not hold forever. He had to make his guardianship real, unassailable. He had to adopt her. The process was a humbling gauntlet. He used the last of his connections, calling in favors from people he hadn't spoken to since his fall from grace. He put on his one good suit and sat in sterile offices, a man who once commanded boardrooms, now pleading his case to skeptical bureaucrats. He was a bankrupt, unemployed man seeking to become the sole guardian of a child. On paper, he was the worst possible candidate. News of his endeavor eventually leaked to the press. likely from someone he had asked for help. It wasn't a major headline, just a short, cruel paragraph in a gossip column known for its biting commentary on the city's elite. What's a bankrupt millionaire to do? For Julian Vance, the answer is apparently adopting a homeless child, a noble gesture or a final desperate cry for attention. Sources say Vance is living in squalor, making this act of charity look more like a tragedy in the making. The words were a public flogging. The laughter he had imagined was now real, printed in black and white. His phone buzzed with texts from the few people who still had his number. Some were feigning concern, others were barely hiding their amusement. It was the final nail in the coffin of his old identity. But as he stood in his apartment, reading the article on his phone, he felt a strange sense of detachment. The sting was there, but it was a surface wound. He looked over at Maya, who was standing at the whiteboard, her brow furrowed in concentration, as she worked on a proof for the Riemann hypothesis, something she did for fun. She was humming a little tune, completely unaware of the world's judgment, and Julian realized he didn't care. Let them laugh. They were laughing at a ghost, at a man who no longer existed. The old Julian Vance would have been mortified, consumed by the shame of it all. But that man had been hollow, his worth measured in stock prices and public opinion. His new worth was measured in the quiet hum of a child's intellect, in the shared joy of a solved equation, in the fierce, protective love that had taken root in the barren soil of his life. A few weeks later, after a grueling final interview where Julian spoke with a raw, desperate honesty that seemed to finally break through the bureaucratic armor, he got the call. The adoption was approved. He was legally, officially, her father. He hung up the phone, his hand trembling. He looked at Maya, who was watching him, her big, dark eyes full of questions. "They said yes," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're stuck with me." A slow, radiant smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had seen her truly, genuinely smile. It lit up the entire room. She ran to him and wrapped her thin arms around his waist in a fierce hug. He knelt and held her, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the simple scent of shampoo and childhood. In the cramped apartment surrounded by peeling paint and a whiteboard full of impossible genius, Julian Vance, the man who had lost everything, finally felt rich. The news of the adoption, however small, did not go unnoticed in the circles Julian once dominated. For most, it was a footnote, a sad, pathetic end to a once great story. But for one man, it was a data point of interest. Alistair Finch sat in what used to be Julian's office. He had redecorated, of course. The cool, minimalist aesthetic was gone, replaced by dark wood, leather, and brass. A monument to old money and ruthless power. Alistair, a man whose ambition was matched only by his lack of conscience, had orchestrated Julian's downfall with surgical precision, exploiting his trust and turning his own innovations against him. He now reigned as the sole CEO of Nexus, the undisputed king of the empire they had built together. He read the gossip column on his tablet, a smirk playing on his lips. The bankrupt millionaire adopts a homeless girl. It was perfect, so utterly, pitifully Julian, always leading with his heart, always susceptible to sentiment. It was the very weakness Alistair had exploited to ruin him. He was about to dismiss it when a detail caught his eye. An anonymous source mentioned the girl's unusual intelligence. Alistair was a man who dealt in assets, and intelligence was the most valuable asset of all. He made a quiet call to a private investigator he kept on retainer for just such occasions. "Find out everything you can about the girl Julian Vance just adopted," he commanded. "I want to know her history, her school records, everything." A few days later, a slim digital file landed in his inbox. It contained Maya's fractured school records from before her parents' death, her time at the library, and, most interestingly, a detailed report from the investigator who had managed to plant a listening device near Julian's apartment for a 24-hour period. The audio was mostly mundane, but it captured snippets of conversations about things like quantum entanglement, non-Euclidean geometry, and algorithmic efficiency. It also contained the investigator's bewildered conclusion: the child speaks like a university professor. The subject, Vance, appears to be acting as her research assistant. Alistair leaned back in his leather chair, a cold gleam in his eye. This was no longer a human interest story. This was an opportunity. Julian, in his pathetic state, had stumbled upon a diamond in the rough. A mind like that, properly cultivated, properly owned, could be invaluable. It could generate patents, create technologies, secure Nexus's dominance for another 50 years. He saw the child, Maya, not as a person, but as an uncut gem, a raw supercomputer. And he saw Julian as what he had always been, a sentimental fool, an obstacle to be removed. Alistair had stolen Julian's company. Now he would try to steal his daughter. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in over a year. "Julian," he said, when the call was answered, his voice a smooth, silken performance of warmth and regret. "It's Alistair. I know it's been a long time, but I heard your news. I think it's time we talked." Julian felt a cold dread snake up his spine when he saw Alistair's name flash on his phone screen. He almost didn't answer, but a grim, weary curiosity won out. He stepped out into the hallway of his apartment building, leaving Maya safely inside, watching a documentary on cellular biology. "What do you want, Alistair?" Julian's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "To help, Julian, to make amends," Alistair said, his voice oozing a practiced sincerity that once would have fooled him. "I was wrong. What I did to you? It was business, but it went too far. I want to fix it." Julian laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You want to fix it? You can't fix this, Alistair." "Perhaps I can," Alistair pressed on, undeterred. "I read about your new family situation. It's noble. But I also know your financial status. A child needs resources, Julian, especially a gifted one." The word gifted hung in the air. Julian's blood ran cold. He knew. "How do you know about that?" "I have my sources," Alistair said smoothly. "Julian, this is bigger than you and me now. It's about her. I want to offer you a way back, a senior advisory role at Nexus, a generous salary, more than enough to provide for her, and for the girl, I want to sponsor her. Give her access to our R&D labs, our top scientists. Imagine what she could achieve with the full backing of Nexus. We could put her in a program for the world's most brilliant minds." The offer was a poisoned chalice. Julian could see the strings, the hidden clauses, the predatory gleam behind the words. Alistair didn't want to sponsor Maya. He wanted to acquire her. He wanted to plug her brain into the Nexus machine and own everything it produced. He wanted to turn her light into profit, to put her genius in a cage of corporate servitude. "She's not an asset, Alistair," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. "She's my daughter." "Of course she is," Alistair said, his tone placating, patronizing. "And as her father, you have to do what's best for her. Can you honestly say that a run-down apartment and a bankrupt guardian is what's best for a mind like that? Think about it, Julian. Don't let your pride ruin her life, like you let it ruin yours." The veiled threat was clear. Alistair was dangling a legal challenge over his head. Is a bankrupt man a suitable guardian? A rage, pure and hot, surged through Julian, burning away the last vestiges of his old despair. This was his line in the sand. This was the hill he would die on. "The conversation is over, Alistair," Julian said, his voice trembling with fury. "If you come anywhere near my daughter, I will do something we'll both regret." He ended the call, his heart pounding. He went back inside, his face a mask of stone. Maya looked up from her documentary. Who was that? No one important, Julian said, forcing a smile. But he knew it was a lie. He had just declared war on the most powerful man he knew, and he had nothing to fight with but a whiteboard and a love that the world would see as a liability. The threat was no longer just mockery in a newspaper, it was real, and it was coming for them. The air in the small apartment grew thick with unspoken tension. Julian tried to shield Maya from his fear, but she was too perceptive. She saw the way his jaw was constantly clenched, the way he would stare out the window for long stretches, his eyes scanning the street below. He began working with a feverish intensity he hadn't felt in years, but it wasn't for himself. It was for her. He and Maya had been toying with an idea for weeks. It had started as one of her thought experiments. She had been explaining the principles of quantum computing to him, using analogies he could barely grasp, and had offhandedly sketched out a concept for a new type of encryption. It wasn't based on mathematical complexity like current methods, but on the unpredictable, probabilistic nature of quantum states. It was, in theory, unbreakable. What had been a game was now a lifeline. Julian poured all his energy into it. He spent his days coding, translating Maya's elegant, ethereal concepts into functional, logical script. Their apartment became a war room. The whiteboard was covered in quantum formulas and flowcharts. Maya, understanding that they were fighting an invisible enemy, worked alongside him, her small face serious, her mind a laser beam cutting through the most complex problems. Just as he was making a breakthrough, the first official shot was fired. A letter arrived from a prestigious law firm, the kind that smelled of money and merciless litigation. It was a formal inquiry from a concerned party into the welfare of Maya Vance, questioning the suitability of her current living situation and Julian's financial and emotional stability to act as her guardian. Alistair was making his move. A storm broke over the city that night, the rain lashing against their windowpane like thrown gravel. The wind howled, a mirror of the turmoil in Julian's soul. He sat at his small table, the lawyer's letter in his trembling hand, the weight of his powerlessness crushing him. He had no money for a legal battle. He had no standing. Alistair would paint him as an unstable pauper who had kidnapped a prodigy, and the world would believe him. He would lose her. The phone rang. It was Alistair. "Have you received the letter, Julian?" Alistair's voice was calm, almost gentle. "This doesn't have to be messy. I'm prepared to make you one final offer. Sign over guardianship to me. I will set you up for life. A trust fund. A quiet house in the country. You'll never have to worry about money again. You can walk away, and everyone will think you did the noble thing, putting her future ahead of your own feelings." Julian looked across the room at Maya. She was asleep on the sofa, her book resting on her chest, her face peaceful. So much trust, so much brilliance, all of it resting on his broken shoulders. Alistair's offer was a devil's bargain. It was everything the old Julian would have craved: wealth, security, an end to the shame of his poverty. He could have his old life back, or some semblance of it. All he had to do was sell this child's soul. He had to trade his daughter for 30 pieces of silver. "Think of her, Julian," Alistair's voice was a venomous whisper in his ear. "Think of the labs, the tutors, the resources, the life you can't give her. Don't be selfish. This is your chance to finally do something right." The choice was laid bare before him, stark and absolute. His past versus his future. The ghost of the millionaire versus the reality of the father. The raging storm outside was nothing compared to the one in his heart. He closed his eyes, and the image of Maya's smile, the real one, the one that had lit up the room when he told her the adoption was final, burned brightly in his mind. It was the most valuable thing he had ever owned. A profound calm washed over him. He knew what he had to do. "Let me be clear, Alistair," Julian said, his voice no longer trembling, but forged into steel. "I would rather spend the rest of my life in this apartment broke and forgotten than let a predator like you anywhere near her. She is my daughter, and you will not have her." He continued, a new power in his voice, the power of a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. "And you're wrong. I'm not going to be broke for long. This project Maya and I have been working on, this new encryption method, it's going to make your entire security division at Nexus obsolete." Alistair chuckled. "You're bluffing, Julian. You're a desperate man making empty threats." "Am I?" Julian said, a grim smile touching his lips. He had spent the last of his favor credit that afternoon on a call with Marcus Thorne, a venture capitalist who was Alistair's biggest rival and hated him with a passion. Julian had sent him a simplified prospectus of the quantum encryption project. Thorne had called back within the hour. "I just closed a seed funding round with Marcus Thorne an hour ago," Julian said, savoring the words. "He's backing us. We're calling the new company Phoenix. It seems fitting, and the first thing my new legal team will be doing is filing a restraining order against you for harassment. So stay away from my family, Alistair. You've already lost." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Julian could almost hear the gears turning in Alistair's mind. The shock, the fury, the disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered. He had tried to buy a child, and in doing so had handed his greatest rival the weapon that would be used against him. Julian hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. The storm outside seemed to quiet down. He walked over to the sofa and gently pulled the blanket up over Maya's shoulders. He had made his choice. He had chosen his daughter over the world, and in doing so, he had saved himself. The bankrupt millionaire was finally truly dead. In his place stood a father, ready to build a new empire, not of glass and steel, but of love and unbreakable code. 1 year later, the sunlight streamed into a spacious, open-plan office that also served as a living room. It wasn't a penthouse, but a renovated loft in a vibrant, artistic neighborhood. The walls were lined with books and whiteboards, but also with Maya's colorful paintings. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the faint, clean smell of ozone from a humming server rack in the corner. Phoenix Innovations was a runaway success. The quantum encryption technology, dubbed Guardian by Maya, had sent shockwaves through the tech industry. It was elegant, secure, and years ahead of its time. Contracts were pouring in. Julian was no longer bankrupt. He was solvent, successful, and more importantly, he was happy. He worked harder than he ever had at Nexus, but the work felt different. It wasn't a climb. It was a creation. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own past. He had found a new purpose, a new identity. He was Maya's father. That was his primary title. CEO was a distant second. He attended her school meetings, helped her with projects, though she rarely needed it, and made sure he was home for dinner every single night. Alistair Finch was a ghost now, faced with a slew of lawsuits from clients whose data was now vulnerable and an aggressive takeover bid from Marcus Thorne's consortium. Bolstered by Phoenix's technology, his position at Nexus had crumbled. He was forced out of his own company, a fall from grace far more public and humiliating than Julian's had ever been. A quiet, poetic justice. Julian stood by the large window looking out at the city. It was the same skyline, but it looked different to him now. It was no longer a monument to what he had lost, but simply a place, a backdrop to the life he was building. "Dad, look," he turned. Maya, now 10 years old and radiating a quiet confidence, stood before a large, gleaming whiteboard. She had mapped out a theoretical model for faster-than-light communication using entangled particles. It was beautiful, impossible, and utterly brilliant. "It's just a theory," she said, a small, shy smile on her face. "But the math works." Julian walked over and studied the elegant equations. He didn't understand half of them, but he understood the mind that had created them. He understood the love that fueled that mind. He put his arm around her shoulders and looked at the board, then at his daughter. Everyone had laughed when the bankrupt millionaire adopted the homeless girl. They saw a broken man making a foolish choice. They couldn't see what he saw. They couldn't see the genius, the love, the future. He was Julian Vance. He was a father. And in the quiet, brilliant light of his new life, he was the richest man in the world.